Hi everyone, welcome to the February 21st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are looking back at last week's racing around the country, primarily focusing on Fairgrounds Saturday card. That's where most of the racing world's eyes were trained on Saturday afternoon into evening as they ran a bunch of stakes races, especially late in the day, and I do mean late in the day as it got pretty dark towards the end of that Fairgrounds card on Saturday. The final race they ran was that Derby Prep, the Grade 2 Risen Star, offering 50 Kentucky Derby qualifying points to the winner. Also on that card was the Rachel Alexandra, the Kentucky Oaks Prep. We'll talk about both of those as well as some other stakes action and undercard races from that Fairgrounds Saturday card. We'll also visit some other venues. Laurel Park had a nice card on Saturday featuring the General George and the Barbara Fritchie. We saw a pretty big speed figure out at Oaklawn Park in their feature race on Saturday, the Razorback, the local prep for the Oaklawn Handicap. And then down at Gulfstream, we saw a new player in the Distaff division emerge in the Royal Delta. So a lot to cover on this podcast, Craig, but Fairgrounds is where most of the action did take place this past weekend.
It did, if you could see it, because as you said, boy, was it dark at the end. I would imagine in person it was probably wasn't as bad as it looked on TV. At least I would hope. But yeah, that was tough to see. But I thought we saw some good performances at the Fairgrounds, but nothing to blow your socks off.
Yeah, I mean, aside from that breakout performance from the Bob Baffert-trained Arabian Night in the Southwest a little bit earlier this year at Oaklawn, these Derby preps that we've been seeing so far for the 3-year-olds have not earned particularly fast speed figures, and I think that was the case once again with this Risen Star, Craig. Angel of Empire, who did win this race in an upset at 13-1, got a 110 TimeformUS speed figure, and that's just a little bit light for the kind of number you usually expect this race to get, but it's kind of in line with what we've been seeing from these 3-year-olds over the past few weeks.
Yeah, I would expect faster this time of year, and actually we had a few faster races earlier on the card that we're going to talk about later, but it was an easy day to make speed figures. There were plenty of routes. I did have a question on Twitter, and it was a legitimate one. Did the changing track, did the track change due to it getting so late in the day? Not necessarily being dark, but just, the weather tends to change, but it didn't look that way at all to me, so it was an okay race for Angel of Empire, certainly a good move forward for him. Also, it's good to keep in mind this race is at 1.125 miles. We won't see many of the other preps at 1.125 miles till much later. Louisiana has changed their schedule a bit the last few years now to race longer earlier. Maybe that has a little bit of an effect. Maybe the horses aren't quite ready, but all in all, just an okay race for me. I mean, I thought Angel of Empire ran fine. He got a decent trip. The pace was solid. It wasn't anything crazy. I think we have only one of the figures are rated in red, and that was pretty much just from the winner, or the leader on the front end was kind of off by himself after that half mile setting a quick pace. But everybody else, the race did seem to kind of fall apart, but the pace doesn't indicate that was the only reason for it.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of those races that got higher speed figures than the Risen Star a little bit later in this podcast, but I agree. I think that this is a race with the 1.125 distance. We did see some horses who have more of an emphasis on stamina really emerge. Angel of Empire, the winner, obviously being one of those. He just feels like the kind of horse that, I mean, we'll see if he ultimately is fast enough to be a contender in the Kentucky Derby, but he feels like the kind of horse that's going to get 1.25 miles with no problem and probably be best going that far. I think we just have yet to see what his ceiling really is going to be. He is yet another horse to emerge from the Brad Cox stable. It was kind of a swapping or changing of the guard in the Brad Cox barn in this Risen Star, as the horse that took all the money coming in here, Victory Formation, who was the favorite for Cox, just didn't get the distance, really didn't run his race at all. And Angel of Empire, the horse that was easily beaten by Victory Formation in his prior start, the Smarty Jones at Oaklawn, usurped that one and the rest of the field to win this race by a length. And I do want to give a shout out to Marcus Hirsch, who was on the TimeformUS forecast last week. And while I know he didn't make Angel of Empire his top pick, he made a really good observation about that Smarty Jones and how Angel of Empire had been ridden out past the wire to pass victory formation on the gallop out. And it seemed like they were really prepping him to go a longer distance. And that's certainly how it played out here as he finished this race pretty powerfully. And like you said, Craig, the race did fall apart. I would say that the horse that probably got the best trip of all was the runner-up Sun Thunder, who just got a masterful ride from Brian Hernandez, saving ground around both turns. There were some runners that were unable to do so, namely the fourth place finisher Tappett's Conquest, who was just wide the entire way, although I will caveat that and say, as somebody who loves to watch trips, this is a very difficult trip to watch, especially that far turn run. I don't know if some of the lights weren't working or what was going on, but it seemed extremely dark, especially on the far turn. You just couldn't really see those horses, and whoever was working the camera just had it far too zoomed out at the top of the stretch. I mean, it was just... it was not a friendly presentation of the race to players. I'll put it that way. So I don't know why they have to run this race in the darkness, but apparently if that's what they want to do, I think they've got to figure out a better way to present this race and actually allow you to see it. But assuming that we do know we were able to follow the horses and see the trips, it did feel like Tappett's Conquest was especially wide around that far turn, and he was right there at the end. Craig, I also want to give a shout out to the third place finisher, Two Phils. This is a horse that I'm kind of becoming a little bit of a fan of. I thought he ran okay behind Instant Coffee in the Lecomte, and of the top four finishers in this race, I thought Two Phils was the one that made that race, that move on the far turn to sort of break the race open. As you said, that leader determinedly was going pretty quickly, especially in the middle portion of the race, and he faded to finish last, and Two Phils was the one that made that move at the 3/8 pole to take over the race. So I thought he hung on pretty well for third, but it just wasn't a race that came back that fast overall.
No, yeah, I thought those two ran fine, Two Phils and Tappett's Conquest. If you had to ask me to pick who was better, I would take those two over Sun Thunder, just because of the difference in trips, as best we could tell. I did thought Two Phils, he looked like a winner turning for home and hung a little bit, but maybe the trip had something to do with that.
Yeah, I think just the way that this race came apart at the end, it really turned into a test of stamina. And the horse that was running through the wire was Angel of Empire. I think we do have to emphasize that. He was really going away in that final 16th of a mile. So definitely one that I think we can look forward to his next prep, because he is the kind of horse that has taken a big step forward with every start of his career. So when you have 3-year-olds with that upward trajectory, there's possibility for further improvement from the winner. So we'll see where they decide to go with him. Maybe the Louisiana Derby in his next start. Let's move on to the Oaks prep from that Fairgrounds Saturday car. It was the Grade 2 Rachel Alexandra, run right before the Risen Star. And, Craig, I talked about this with Marcus on the forecast. I know we've talked about it a little bit just when we were mentioning her races in the past. Hoosier Filly is the kind of horse that horse players like you and I are just generally going to be somewhat against, because she's been visually impressive, she's one gear down, but you never really know if these horses are going to have more in the tank when they get asked the question. And sure, the trip might not have worked out as ideally as they hoped it would have, but she got asked the question in this race, and the answer is she didn't have a whole lot more left in the tank, and 2-5 was just significantly underlaid on her.
She had no real business, in my opinion, being that low. And sometimes these horses will make you look silly when you go against them. They'll run off the screen and improve their speed figure 15 points. But when the public goes this overboard, I think you have to take a chance. So we're basically on TimeformUS speed figures, 4 horses who all came in looking very similar to each other, and the odds discrepancy was just crazy. And it turned out that the 2 longest of those were able to get the job done and do so pretty easily. I know Hoosier Filly had a little trouble at the start. I don't think it was enough to describe the 8 lengths that she finished arrears of the top 2. And I just don't think she ran that well. And Pretty Mischievous and Miracle were able to basically do things on their own on the front end, and nobody could come close to him, really. Pretty Mischievous was able to wear down Miracle late, but I thought both of them ran okay. Speed figure wise, it's not the prettiest race. They both are going to get a 105 for their effort, which is a slight upgrade for Pretty Mischievous. Miracle had run a 105 last time out. So again, not the fastest race we're going to see, but just as betters, I thought this was a fun race and one that if you're looking to beat a heavy favorite, this was prime time to do it.
Yeah, it would have made my day a little brighter if Miracle had been able to hold on in this race. But like you said, both of the top two finishers were value in this race because they had each run speed figures that suggested they were fast enough to cause this kind of upset. And they were the ones that moved forward in here. And we had kind of gotten that hint from Pretty Mischievous at her prior start at Fairgrounds. It seemed like she had taken a real step forward from her loss to Hoosier Philly in the Goldenrod. And Miracle had run a competitive speed figure in her last race in October of her 2-year-old season. So there were legitimate reasons to believe that these two fillies could be on par with Hoosier Philly, and just given the trip not working out and the fact that she really didn't have much of an ability edge over these horses, not a big surprise to see that favorite go down to defeat at 2-5. And obviously, the Kentucky Derby chatter is going to stop with her now. We'll see if Hoosier Philly turns into a legitimate Kentucky Oaks threat, because the reality is, Craig, we haven't seen any of the 3-year-old fillies run particularly fast speed figures. Both last year when they were 2-year-olds, the Breeders' Cup Juvenile fillies has not come back to be that strong a race, and all of the preps that we've seen since then have been relatively slow compared to what we usually see at this time of year. So I think we're still waiting for that 3-year-old filly star to emerge, if there's one out there.
I would agree. I can't think of a fast race, at least in one of the points races. Maybe there's been some in maiden and allowance races, but so far a pretty uninspiring group. And we've kind of beat up on Hoosier Philly a little bit. I don't want to let Chop Chop off the hook. I mean, if we want to talk about a real no-show, I don't know what happened with her, but she absolutely did no running whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that does call into question her stablemate, the Alice look, a little bit, since that one had been beaten pretty easily by Pretty Mischievous in her prior start. And that race that they ran in the, I believe it was the Silver Bullet Day a month ago, it didn't seem like there was a whole lot behind those two Brad Cox trainees, so this performance definitely didn't flatter that one. And I think the Alice look, with her 107 Timeform US speed figure, is shaping up as one of the fastest 3-year-old fillies out there. We'll see if that race turns out to be a true predictor moving forward. Let's move on to another dirt race going the 1.16 distance run on Saturday at Fairgrounds. That was the Grade 3 mine shaft for the older horses, and this was a pretty exciting fight to the finish, Craig. And whenever you see horses in a tussle to the wire, if Pioneer of Medina is in that mix, you can be pretty sure he's going to be the one to stick his nose in front, because this horse is pretty game and he loves to have a fight on his hands.
It is a game win, and it came down to him and Mr. Wireless. It was a solid race. The winner's going to get a 120 Timeform US speed figure. The runner-up a 119, and he's just a very game horse. He had a very good rider on him in Luis Saez. Not knocking Deshaun Parker at all, but if you give me a match race with those two in the last 16th of a mile, I'm going to take Luis Saez every time. And you put him on a game horse like Pioneer Medina, and he was able to get the job done. I thought Mr. Wireless ran just fine in defeat. He just, he held on till the last few strides. He's one that seems to be getting back to that form we saw as a 3-year-old. He's kind of been up and down. Don't think he's like a top class horse, but he's game. He's always there, and he definitely had a little better, tougher trip, in my opinion.
Yeah, Mr. Wireless just been a little bit unlucky in these fairgrounds races. Not that he's had bad trips in all of them, but he's been the runner-up in every race in this series through the winter, going back to the Tenacious, through the Louisiana, now the Mine Shaft. He's been second every time, and he just couldn't quite forge past Pioneer of Medina in the stretch. I do want to give a shout-out to the third-place finisher, Run Classic, who was also right in that mix at the end of the race. He was my picket here, and I thought 8-1 was a very fair price on him. Got the trip I was hoping for, because I know, Craig, both you and I had bemoaned the fact that they rated him in his prior start, and Raylo Gutierrez was much more aggressive this time, pressing that leader, Hoist the Gold, and took over at the top of the stretch like he might be able to hold on, got to drifting in mid-stretch, kind of not really engaging with those top two finishers, and I think that was his downfall, but stayed on pretty gamely to lose this race by less than a length.
He ran well. The pace was solid. It's not like he was alone. He was tracking Hoist the Gold in here. Because of that pace, he actually winds up with the same speed figure as the winner, a 120. I guess the one disappointment in the race, or the biggest disappointment, would be Tawnyport, the 3-year old who we saw some good efforts out of last year. Um, wasn't able to come back and show that form, but it was his first start off a layoff. We'll see how he does moving forward, but this wasn't a good race by him at all.
Yeah, Tawnyport failed to step forward, and the winner of the first two races in this series, Happy American, was just a total non-factor in this race. Actually got more pace to close into in this race than he had in his prior start to Louisiana, but he was unable to launch his typical late run, so just an off day for that one. Let's move over to the turf course at Fairgrounds, and the most prestigious race they ran on the turf on Saturday was the Grade 3 Fairgrounds for the older horses, and just cool to see two Emmys coming back every year, Craig, seemingly in top form. He's getting up there in age now, but he just keeps delivering these nice performances, and he was a dominant winner of this race. You could see from a long way out, nobody else was in his same league.
Yeah, he's a cool horse. I've become a fan of his. I believe he won the Arlington Million back when it was still at Arlington at a huge price, if memory serves. And he ran fine. I assume when you said the turf course at Fairgrounds, you kind of did the air quotes thing because it's still just one of those that's really hard to get a handle on. They're still not racing anywhere near the rail. The rail's way out. I think it's at 34 feet. The course doesn't look good. Nobody seems to want to run on that temporary rail. Everybody gets off of it, but he ran good. Like I said, a 127 speed figure, which kind of fits with all the horses in between. Say what you will about the course, but he completely dominated this field on the front end, and it's not like he set slow fractions doing it. It was just kind of an honest pace all the way throughout. The pace figures are all within a point or two of each other from start to finish.
Yeah, and arguably when he had run in that prior race in this series, the Colonel Bradley, the turf course had been even more tilted towards that outside rail. It just seemed like horses that were going down towards that temporary rail had absolutely no chance. Marcus, who I had on the forecast last week, had been saying that the turf course had been starting to play a little bit more fairly. You were seeing horses do some effective running closer to the inside. The riders didn't really ride it that way on Saturday. They just kind of stayed out towards the center of the course if they were on a live horse. We saw that happen in race after race, and that was the case with James Graham and two Emmys. He wasn't right on that outside rail, but just kind of went down the center of the course, and I don't think anything was beating him on this day. He was just a dominant winner, and Gentle Soul, who had finished ahead of him in his prior start, getting that coveted outside or stand-side rail trip, was just no match on this occasion, as two Emmys did really take a step forward second off the layoff. Let's move on to the Al Stall Memorial. This was the race for the fillies and mares, run a little bit earlier in that Fairgrounds card on Saturday. And certainly not quite of the quality of the Grade 3 Fairgrounds, Craig. We just had a lot of high-level allowance horses in this race, not really graded stakes performers, and it was a Godolphin 1-2 finish with Lake Lucerne getting the job done here. Just a modest speed figure for these types, though.
Yeah, I will admit I had to take a nap because of the length of the Fairgrounds card, so I didn't even see this race. She ran fine. She got a 114 speed figure, which is an improvement over what we'd seen in her recent races. I would even say this was, well, it wasn't really a drop in the class from the last one, but she had run in a graded stakes and didn't really run at all at Churchill, but she's been fine, and it seemed like it was her turn to win one, and got the job done here, but I don't think we're going to be seeing any of these make noise in graded stakes.
And just to note, anyone who's looking at the TimeformUS chart, this race did get the pace downgrade because it would have been rated pretty close to the Fairground Stakes, I think just 6 points apart if you had played it straight, Craig. But this race featured a much faster pace, and a number in the 120s just doesn't make any sense for these kinds of horses.
No, this was one I had no problem. And it sounds kind of funny saying that when you see the fractions because they just look glacial with a 50 half and a 116 3/4. But you got to take into consideration the course that it was run on, the rail being out. You've mentioned before how they time these races at the fairgrounds. No matter where the rail is, they just use the same timing eyes. So obviously they're running further than a mile and a 16th. That's why anything when the rail's not at 0 is listed as about distance because they're just running further. So yeah, I had no problem at all with the pace downgrade in this case. It made a lot of sense.
And the final turf race that they ran on Saturday at the fairgrounds, actually between those two routes, was the Colonel Power Stakes, going the 5.5 furlong distance, and that was won by the horse that somewhat surprisingly went off favored, Evan Singh, who drew in from the also eligible list. And Craig, I know when we had handicapped that Lecomte day, the race that Evan Singh had been entered in there and was ultimately scratched out of, both you and I had been interested in him there. That race got rained off the turf, or they took it off the turf, I should say. Evan Singh got to run on the turf course here, launching his 2023 campaign, and was able to get the job done. And this is the kind of horse that, even though there wasn't a whole lot of pace signed on, once you saw him third in the early stages, stalking those leaders, knowing the kind of finish he possesses, he was going to be tough to hold off.
He was, and you mentioned the pace. All the fractions are coded in blue for this one. It was pretty slow pace, and he took that big jump forward that both of us were expecting when we talked about him last time. He ran a 117 speed figure here, which is his best in his career. He had won a 112 run a 112 back at Saratoga last year, but good forward improvement for a 4-year-old, which is what you really want to see. And he looks dangerous. I like the fact that he was able to sit up closer, much closer than we've seen him ever do in a sprint race before.
Yeah, this is the kind of horse that when you isolate his sprints, particularly his 5.5 furlong sprint races, he's been consistently effective throughout his career. And as just a newly turned 4-year-old, he's one that could definitely have a major say in this division moving forward. But clearly, he'll face some better rivals in future starts. Though I do want to give a shout out to the horse that was second in this race, Anguston, the 8-year-old who was coming back off yet another long layoff here. This was just his second start since the summer of 2019, his second race in 3.5 years, and he was able to nearly pull off an upset here, finishing second. Just a pretty cool horse. You rarely see that.
Yeah, that was a good story, and he actually was bet. Its bettors weren't fooled at all. I mean, he wasn't bet like a favorite, but he only went off 7-1 off that long layoff. When he's able to make it to the races, and until recently, it's not like that was a problem. This was his 22nd career start, but he's had a couple of those red layoff lines in TimeformUS, and they're both big ones. Both of them were 600 days plus. But the two starts following those lines are a good allowance win at Churchill, and now a good second in a stake. So good training job by Lon Wiggins with this one.
Now, we are going to talk about two of the non-stakes events on Saturday at Fairgrounds. One of those was an allowance race for the 3-year-olds, run at 1 16th on the dirt, so a little bit shorter than the Risen Star. That went as the 8th race of the day, and that was won by Dennington. And Greg, a lot of chatter after this Saturday card about how this allowance race, on really every speed figure I looked at, including the TimeformUS speed figures, got a slightly higher number than the Risen Star. Dennington, the winner of this race, got a 111, actually, as did all of the top 3 finishers in here. Now, as the speed figure maker, what do you make of this? Because the top 3, they all took huge steps forward here from their prior top speed figures, and these numbers suggest that they might have been the trifecta in the Risen Star if they had run in that race, though often you can't make those direct translations.
No, I don't know if these were to meet up next time in a Louisiana Derby, if I would suddenly favor them because of just the tiny speed figure edge. I mean, it's just 1 point over the winner. The distance will be longer. The Risen Star was at 1 1/8. This one was just at 1 1/16. The next race would be at 1 3/16. So these would be stretching out a full furlong. So I would like to think the shorter distance maybe had something to do with it in mid-February of the 3-year-old season. It was certainly a good performance. I mean, the clock doesn't lie. As I said, it was consistent throughout the day. Making speed figures was really a breeze for a card that can be troublesome sometimes when it's as long as this one. But with only 3 turf races, plenty of dirt races to go on, no weather intervening, no rainstorms or anything like that, it kind of just had to go with the clock. But personally, I would still prefer those from the Risen Star because the speed figure difference is just not enough to get me excited.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Craig. I think this is the kind of day where you do have to play it straight and just use the same variant throughout, because these horses are lightly raced. There's not definitive evidence that the track changed at any point. And we'll talk about another race in just a second, but the speed figure kind of jumps out at you a little bit. But in this Dennington allowance race, it's the kind of effort where you do look at the speed figures that these top really 4 or 5 finishers were assigned, and you raise your eyebrows a little bit. I mean, you see Banishing, who was 5th in here, and he's repeating the TimeformUS speed figure basically that he got in his impressive maiden victory, but he lost this race by over 8 lengths. So you do wonder if a horse like that actually regressed rather than holding his form and everybody else improved. It just makes you wonder a little bit, and there were other factors to consider. I mean, this card was so long, and as you said, I mean, they ran the Risen Star in darkness. Who knows what other changes took place between now and then? Even if we can't quantify them and seeing this direct pattern throughout the day, sometimes races do get run a little bit in isolation, and this feels like one of them where that might have been the case. And I think we do also have to bring up, Craig, these horses in this allowance race were able to run on Lasix, and the Risen Star horses, of course, could not. And the trainer of the winner, Ken McPeak, he is a trainer, if you look up the stats, who has amazing numbers with first-time Lasix and very poor numbers with horses not running on Lasix or coming off Lasix. So I think that's just something to be aware of as we evaluate these horses going between allowance and maiden company to stakes.
Yeah, I agree with that. Lasix can definitely have an issue. I think it definitely helps horses run a little bit faster. I know you put some good stats out that on Twitter when I was away last week that if you haven't, if people haven't seen it, it's worth scrolling your feed to see. It's not as big as maybe some people might think, but I do think there's definitely an edge there.
Yeah, Ken McPeak was one of those trainers who had a positive ROI first-time Lasix and an ROI of like 29 cents or something like that coming off Lasix. So something to be aware of with Dennington when he runs back. And this is a horse we should note who was easily beaten by Instant Coffee and Two Fills in the Lecomte, was distantly beaten third in the Smarty Jones behind Angel of Empire as well as Victory Formation. So, I mean, he had been decidedly worse than the Risen Star horses coming into this card. And did things really change, or was this just a different set of circumstances? I think that's one of those things that they'll have to debate until these horses actually run against each other, likely next time in the Louisiana Derby. And we should talk about one more race from that Saturday card at Fairgrounds, Greg, that earned a pretty notable speed figure. That was a maiden special weight event run a little bit earlier in the day, going the 6 furlong distance, where Bishop's Bay was the winner, leading home 2 Brad Cox trained first-time starters. He got a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure for his debut. This feels like the kind of maiden race where, I mean, if you can rate the stake consistently and take this number at face value, there were some very talented firsters in this field.
Yeah, there were, and the good news is there were plenty of sprints on the card, particularly early. I think it was the all but the second race of the first 5 were at this same 6 furlong distance. It was a again, pretty easy day to make speed figures, and unless you want to make the argument that the track slowed down later, which wouldn't really even hold water because all the sprints came early and they were rated by themselves. So it just seems like a really fast race. Now, it looks a little odd because the top 2 were so close, but when you see they're both trained by Brad Cox and it was a big gap back to third, it's not all that surprising, and it's not like the winner surprised people. I mean, he went off 1-2, and I think what was a 11 or 12 horse field. So the word was out on him. He's certainly bred to be a good one, and he ran like a very good one.
Yeah, I mean, it's another one of those races that kind of makes you raise your eyebrows a little bit, kind of like that Dennington race. I mean, the horse with experience that took some money in this race, I mean, I say took some money, he went off at 9-1, Quaternion, who was 5th, I mean, he had been second in that highly rated First Defender race, and First Defender was one of those horses that was involved in that finish in the Dennington allowance race on this card, and he's a pretty fast horse in his own right, and Quaternion had finished second, beaten 5 lengths by that foe of some quality, yet in this race he gets the same speed figure and is beaten a dozen lengths, finishing 5th. I mean, it just makes you wonder a little bit, is it possible that there were all of these good first-time starters in one race? But as you said, the clock doesn't lie, and it seems like this day was pretty consistent overall outside of these 2 dirt races. So, I mean, it just makes sense to rate them all together. And as you said, the first two finishers, they came from the Brad Cox stable. One of them was clearly highly touted coming in here. The winner, Bishop's Bay, went off at 1-2. So obviously he had been training well ahead of this race. First Mission, the runner-up, also took money, going off as the second choice. So the word was out that these horses had ability, obviously, for them to be that price compared to a horse who had actually achieved a 90-plus TimeformUS speed figure on debut, going off at 9-1. So not a huge surprise that there was some quality among the firsters in this race. Visually, I really liked the performance of Bishop's Bay because he showed easy early speed down the backstretch. Florent Geroux had a handful of horse just kind of standing up in the stirrups around the far turn, and Louis Saez, who was riding First Mission, was really asking this horse at the top of the stretch and built up quite a bit of momentum to challenge the eventual winner at the 8th pole. And you could tell that Florent got a little bit caught off guard by that stablemate ranging up alongside him with momentum, and he pretty abruptly set down Bishop's Bay and asked him for run, and that horse showed a turn of foot and kicked on to hold off his stablemate. So you like to see that, the horse just having this handy nature to him where he shows such easy speed and then has a kick when asked. So really likable attributes from Bishop's Bay. And on top of all of that, he is bred to stretch out by Uncle Mo, Out of a Dam, Catch My Drift, who was a stakes winner going 1 mile and an eighth on the dirt. He's a half-brother to Strava, who was stakes placed routing. So there really is pedigree for this horse to go on.
Oh, no doubt about that. They don't always, when they run this fast early, show that same ability around 2 turns, but with him, I see no reason to think he wouldn't. Something I didn't mention, I think I said the speed figures for the top 2 were 115 and 114. They were actually knocked down a little bit because all the fractions are in blue. Not that the race was particularly slow early, but they finished so fast. That's part of why they ran away from the field. The final time figure was actually a 119 for Bishop's Bay, so that's always a good sign for horses that are stretching out. This horse was actually improving his figures as the race got longer.
And it just kind of supported the argument that this might have been an unusually talented group of first-time starters. The 3rd and 4th place finishers also deserve some mention. I mean, they got 100-plus TimeformUS speed figures for their finishes, and they're also horses with plenty of pedigree. 3rd place finisher Betera, he is Out of a Dam. That's a half-sister to Sharing, that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf winner. The 4th place finisher Ocean City, he's a half-brother to Jackie's Warrior for Steve Asmussen. So this might have been an unusually talented maiden race, and I think we'll get confirmation of that when these horses run back at their prior starts, but clearly the top 2 are ones that you could get excited about from the Brad Cox stable. Let's move on to another venue, Laurel Park on Saturday. They ran 2 Grade 3 events, the General George and the Barbara Fritchie, in addition to some other stakes, listed stakes a little bit earlier in the day. Craig, the General George, it drew a pretty interesting field. Lynn Cash, who I know that you've become a fan of some of his horses, he's had a presence in all of these races, and he, I believe, sent out 3 horses in the General George, and Eastern Bay was the one that got the job done here, and kind of unusual for this stable, a horse coming off a layoff to win.
That's the point I was going to make. He runs his horses so often that you don't always expect him to win this way. I think this one had been away since October, the end of October, which for Lynn Cash, we should almost have a special algorithm to give him a red line when it happens, but it didn't seem to matter. He was able to bring the 9-year-old back in his first start of the year, got the job done. He was a horse who had run a good second behind Elite Power, who in the Vosburg, who obviously went on to win the Breeders' Cup Sprint. Now, it was a distant second, but this horse has been in really good form for a long time, and he was a claim for just $35,000 earlier last year, and he's just a really cool story. A 9-year-old gelding getting the job done in the graded stakes, and I would imagine we're going to see a lot of them because even before he was in the cash barn, this horse was a warrior who just has run a ton. This was his 53rd start, so he's obviously very sound, a solid horse, and I look for better things. Now, I'm not saying he's going to jump up and suddenly be a top sprinter. He doesn't run fast enough at this point. He only got a 114 for the win. I say only, but it's still for a 9-year-old gelding. That's really cool.
Yeah, and these Lynn Cash horses, they're not always known for their consistency. I mean, many of them run so often that you do just see some ups and downs in their performances from week to week. But Eastern Bay just shows up every time and continues to run his race, and it seems like he's been actually improving the more time he spends in this stable. So really nice effort from him. And I will also note, Craig, this race, it doesn't feature a fast pace in terms of the coatings, but when you watch it, it was a race that kind of fell apart. I mean, the speeds for the first quarter to half mile, I mean, they were hounded by Eastern Bay, and Eastern Bay was the only one that went on after that. And actually, the horses that finished second, third, and fourth behind him came from far back in the pack, especially the runner-up, Yodelie, who he was out the back door early. So this was a race that fell apart. So I think that's just another reason to maybe upgrade the performance of Eastern Bay. And I do just also want to briefly mention the third place finisher, Barron, just had a disastrous start, stumbled very badly coming out of the gate. So that's probably a viable excuse for him.
Yeah, I think he ran very well. It was one when you were watching the race, you kind of expected him to be right up on the front end, battling with Pirate Rick, another Lynn Cash horse who's very fast early. But when that one was clear, kind of was looking for Barron to find him, and obviously the start compromised him. But to his credit, he was running on at the end, which kind of goes against his proven running style.
Now, run over the same 7 furlong distance for the fillies and mares was the Grade 3 Barbara Fritchie, one race earlier, and this one, in a minor upset, was won by Sway To and Fro. On the front end, Craig, this race actually featured a faster pace than the General George, but the pace held together more in this race than the other one, as Sway To and Fro was just able to turn away all challengers on the lead.
Yeah, and they ran them back to back. I have to say, TimeformUS, I don't know who was responsible for this. It wasn't me, but I always laugh when I see the abbreviation calls it the Babs Fritch. Whoever did that, I give them a thumbs up because every year it's been that way ever since we started. It just cracks me up. So I see it does you as well.
I'm sorry. It's the first time I'm seeing that.
Oh, no kidding.
Go on, Craig.
But yeah, it just always makes me laugh. But yeah, Sway To and Fro did well. I think it was a race where the pace was solid, as you say. One of the fractions is even in red. She was actually dueling with a horse who finished last, albeit a long shot, but they were going pretty quick up front. And she just is a horse who likes to win races. She's now won more than half her races in 16 career starts. She gets a 114 speed figure for the win. So good solid effort from her, and just a really cool filly who's 4 and seems to be going in the right direction. So she's going to be a force sprinting in that Mid-Atlantic circuit.
Yeah, kind of another horse that, even more so than Eastern Bay, has been a real rags to riches story. I mean, claimed for just $16,000 by these connections, and now she's won hundreds of thousands of dollars and is a Grade 3 winner. It's something that I know that we don't see every day, and I can't say that, frankly, I've ever seen. She is a graded stakes winner who is a South Carolina bred. I can't recall seeing too many South Carolina breds, period, and certainly not any graded stakes horses. So just an interesting fact about Sway and To and Fro. And we'll talk about one more race from that Laurel card on Saturday. It was the John B. Campbell for the older horses, going the 2-turn mile and a 16th, and this one was won on the front end by Nimitz Class. And Craig, this is a race where I think the public was savvy enough to know that this horse had a chance to make the front end, and they bet him down to a short price, and it kind of played out in that fashion where there was just no speed signed on, and this horse was able to get away with some pretty pedestrian fractions up front.
Yeah, good ride by the rider, Toledo. I forget his first name. I know it starts with a J. But yes, he was savvy because this horse isn't really a front runner. He's running some sprint races, but even in his routes, he's kind of come from off the pace. But he took it to him here, was able to be aggressive and get to the front end. And it was a good effort by him. The Campbell's always a race that has a soft spot in my heart because I remember seeing live Broad Brush, who's my favorite horse of all time, win this race. So I've always been a big fan of the Campbell, and it was a good effort by him. It's not just that he set the slow pace. I mean, he was hounded throughout. There was when the pace is that slow, you're going to have plenty of company on the front end. And he just blew the field away in the stretch, didn't give any others a chance. There were some pretty decent horses in here. Treasure Trove is a horse we've talked about on the show before, one of the many Lynn Cash horses in this race as well. But Nimitz Class with that 118 was a good, strong effort and as good as we've seen from him. So yet another 4-year-old who's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, watching this race, you could see he had so much left in the tank at the top of the stretch, and he kicked away from that field like a turf horse when they asked him for run at the quarter pole. So definitely a horse that has relished the stretch out in distance after spending the first part of his career sprinting, and he is actually now 3 for 3 in dirt routes. So stretching out on dirt has definitely been one of the keys to the success of Nimitz class. On to Oaklawn Park, and we'll stick with the older dirt routers, though at a slightly higher level in the Grade 3 Razorback, Craig. And I think this was the race that achieved the highest dirt speed figure of the weekend, as Last Samurai caused a bit of an upset here, winning at 8-1 over West Willpower, as these two drew far ahead of the rest of the field and earned a nice 125 TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, and no for Wayne Lucas, no less. A guy who sometimes you tend to forget about, but he just keeps popping up and winning races. The speed figures surprised me when I sat down to do them, but as always, Oaklawn is all dirt all the time. There were plenty of routes on the card, and it seems like a totally legit number. Last Samurai had run a good fourth in the Pegasus last time behind Art Collector, and just seems to be moving in the right direction. He's a 5-year-old. He's not a 4-year-old like some of the others we talked about. But he seems like his best days are ahead of him because he just keeps running faster and faster speed figures when he shows up.
Yeah, he's just one of these winter horses. He got really good last year into the springtime when he actually won the Oaklawn Handicap at 12-1. This Razorback, of course, being the prep for the Oaklawn Handicap, or one of the preps for the Oaklawn Handicap. So we'll see if he's able to pull off that same feat this year. You would think that the 1.125 distance would be even better for him because he's a horse that has been known to have plenty of stamina. I think he's even placed in 1.5 races on the dirt. So Last Samurai, definitely a horse that can go longer than the 1.16 distance that he got to work with on Saturday. But not a big surprise that this race got a big speed figure when you look at the margin between these top two and the rest of the field. The third place finisher, Law Professor, is a pretty good horse, and he just got dropped by these top two at the top of the stretches. You could see Last Samurai was building up a lot of momentum coming around that far turn, and Christian Torres got him into the clear, and he is the kind of horse that when he gets that clear run and hits top gear, he is just a relentless finisher, and he's going to run you down, and that's what he did to West Willpower. And, take nothing away from the winner, because West Willpower is a horse that has been pretty fortunate in a few starts in a row. I wouldn't be crying any tears for him. He's gotten slow pace after slow pace, easy trip after easy trip, and wasn't able to make it another victory here, but it just seemed like the winner ran a better race on the day.
Yeah, the winner was better, but I don't want to knock West Willpower too much. I mean, he's a horse who is at least running fast races. He has had things go his own way as a bettor. He's the kind of horse that I'm probably going to continue to go against as long as he keeps getting those easy trips. But when he gets them, he takes advantage. It's not like he throws in the towel when challenged. He fights it out to the wire.
Yeah, and the disastrous effort in here came from Ginobili, who went off as the third choice, I believe, at 7-2, when he was unable to make the lead, kind of got bumped at the start, was in tight after that, and if a horse like this is not getting to the front end in a 1.16 race, he really is not going to have a chance, and he backed up and was not a factor in this spot. Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, where the graded stakes that they ran on Saturday was the Royal Delta, this one going 1.16 on the dirt course for the fillies and mares, and I think we're seeing two major players emerge in this distaff division, Craig, in the top two finishers here, Classy Edition and Kathleen O. Not a big surprise that Kathleen O is having success on these races, since she was among the top 3-year-old fillies on the Kentucky Oaks Trail last year. Classy Edition, though, I think one that some people might have forgotten about after she was unable to make the Kentucky Oaks last year, but she has come back in raging form as a 4-year-old for Todd Pletcher.
Yeah, if people listened to our show, they wouldn't have forgot because we definitely talked about her last race where she ran off the screen with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, and she almost matched it here. She wound up with a 117, knocked down a little bit because of a slow pace. The final time's actually going to be right around that 120 mark as well, so good effort from her, but Kathleen O is a good one too. I don't want to slate her too much. Just her one downfall seems to be that lack of early speed, and it's getting her in trouble in these races. You just wonder when she's going to be able to catch a field that doesn't have these slow paces.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make the argument that Kathleen O might have run the better race on this occasion because she really had everything working against her here. She was behind early, the pace was glacial, especially for that opening quarter mile, and Classic Edition was right on top of the pace, basically could kick away whenever she wanted to under Irad Ortiz. And Kathleen O had a lot of work to do just to get into contention, and she really took it to Classy Edition in the stretch. These two were finishing pretty quickly across the wire. Classy Edition just had that pace advantage where she was able to hold on, but I would put these two on fairly equal footing moving forward.
I would. It's too. The habit is. I agree with you. She ran the better race. I just wish she would be able to show some kind of early speed. When the pace is this slow, it's kind of a negative that she's still way back at the back of the pack.
Now, Greg, there were a number of maiden races that we could have talked about on the podcast this week, a few that actually earned 100 plus TimeformUS speed figures from the 3-year-olds. I just wanted to highlight one from Gulfstream Park a little bit earlier in the week on Thursday, a race run actually over the Tapeta course going 1 mile and 70 yards, because I think we might have seen some pretty nice horses in here that could have a future perhaps on the turf, if not only synthetic, including the winner, Turf King, a first-time starter from the Chad Brown stable, who's sired by Kingman. This seems like one that's going to have turf in his future.
That's what I would have assumed. This was for a synthetic race. It seemed like a surprisingly strong field. I mean, the first time Chad Brown horse was 8-1 in here when he won. So obviously there's some others. There was a Todd Pletcher that took some money. So seems like a pretty strong field for synthetics, and the speed figure says the same thing. It came back a 106. Even the third place finisher, that Todd Pletcher horse, ran a 104. He actually had a couple in here running third and fourth, but a good strong race. I would obviously, outside of Gulfstream, there's not a lot of places to run on synthetic unless you ship north or go to Canada or head the Turfway where they don't really have the kind of races these connections would be looking for. So good effort, but as you said, I would expect Turf King to come back on the turf. This was a race that for Gulfstream featured a very slow pace on the synthetic, even though the times are usually pretty fast there. So that 25 opening quarter is illuminating to tell you that things were slow, but Turf King was still able to run down two of his main rivals who had a head start on him.
Yeah, and watching this race, it was nice to see the professionalism that Turf King displayed. I mean, he saved ground early, but tipped out at the top of the stretch. It was awkward for about a stride or two, but once he leveled off, I mean, he just had that reach to his stride that you often see from the progeny of Kingman. Just, he's all racehorse, so definitely one that should translate that form to the turf. And I do want to give a shout out to the third place finisher, Clever Thought, who, you mentioned how slow the pace was, Craig. He was the one that was really launching a big run from the back of the pack, and this is actually a horse that took more money as a first-time starter than the winner Turf King for the Todd Pletcher Bard. And this is a Clever Thought. He was wearing, I believe, the Mike Rapoli silks in this race, but do note he's co-owned by the Phipps stable. He's actually a Phipps homebred. He's out of the Damn Puzzling, who was a sister to Dancing Forever, their Grade 1 turf winner that raced under the Phipps colors. So Clever Thought has a lot of pedigree behind him, and another one that could definitely translate that form to the turf and appears to have some ability based on this career debut. Let's finish things up by going out west, talk about one race out at Santa Anita from this past week, and actually one that was run yesterday as we record this on Tuesday morning. The Tisnow Stakes for the California breds, won by the Chosen Vron. And Greg, we haven't gotten too many opportunities to talk about the Chosen Vron on this podcast. I know he's kind of been on the cusp of getting onto our rundown a few times, but this is just such a cool horse. He's so versatile, and he just keeps showing up.
He did, and he's still running, seems to be faster and faster races. He's a 5-year-old gelding. He actually ran his career best on Monday. It's going to be a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. With the holiday, I'm actually due in Southern California for Monday, so I can say that I know what the figure will be. Just a really cool horse, as you say. He's now won 10 out of 14 starts. He does it on turf. He does it on dirt. He does it sprinting. He does it going 2 turns. So pretty much you can put this horse anywhere he wants, and if he can run speed figures like we saw on Monday, he's the kind of horse who could probably be competitive in open company, something he's very rarely been given a chance to do.
Yeah, I think you said this speed figure is going to be around a 119. And I mean, he's run numbers in the 1 teens a number of times. And this, of course, was a dirt route. It was going the 1 mile distance on the dirt. But I mean, he has run comparable numbers going turf sprints, dirt sprints, going longer on the turf. I mean, he can just do it all. And aside from that distance versatility, he's also got a versatility of running style. He can come from off the pace. He can do it on the front end. I mean, this is just a really tough horse to beat when he's facing off against California breds. Clearly, with that state bred condition available to him, he's got a lot of options for going off at short prices in these races. I'd be interested to see if they start to aim a little bit higher with him, because he's starting to run the kinds of numbers that say maybe he could crack into some of these graded stakes divisions out in Southern California, especially a few of those like the dirt sprint division that don't seem to have that many top players.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. He's mostly sprinted, but as I look through his PPs, this was his third dirt route, and he's won them all, including the Grade 3 Affirmed Stakes, where he beat a horse named Defunded, who's turned out to be pretty good.
Yeah, he's definitely a neat horse racing out in Southern California. Well, that's all the racing to recap this week, Craig. I haven't taken much of a look at what's upcoming on Saturday, other than the fact that I know they are running the Rebel Stakes out at Oaklawn, so I imagine we'll take a look at that card to see how the Pick 5 sequence is shaping up, and maybe that's one that we talk about on the forecast. But I know that I'm looking forward to that Rebel Stakes, because as far as the Derby preps have gone so far, I think we've been slow to get some top performances coming in from these 3-year-olds, but it does appear that there is a lot of quality entered in that Rebel on Saturday.
Yeah, the PPs are already out. I'm looking at them as you speak. I imagine that's where we'll go, but we won't make any commitments yet. The Honeybees just before that has a big field as well, so it looks like it could be a solid card.
Well, everybody, look forward to that. The TimeformUS forecast, which will be coming out a little bit later in the week. But for now, thanks for tuning in. Remember to always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening to the Pacecast this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming out in the latter half of the week.